The ledger had never been questioned before. It sat where it always had, on the broad wooden desk near the office window, its spine cracked from years of use, its pages yellowed by humidity and time. It was a book of certainty. Numbers lived there, totals, losses, gains, things that could be measured and justified. The ledger did not hold opinions. It did not hold doubt, and yet, on a morning when the river lay still and the air felt heavier than usual, doubt was pressed into its pages all the same. No one announced the change. No bell rang. No order was given. A pen simply moved where it had never moved before, carving out a narrow column along the far right edge of the page. The handwriting was careful, smaller than the rest, almost restrained, as though the writer feared being overheard by the paper itself. A date appeared first, written with unusual precision. February 3rd, 1836. Beneath it came a line that did not belong among figures of yield and inventory. Female child, unusual appearance. That was all. No explanation followed. No correction. No justification. The ledger accepted it without protest, the way it accepted everything else. Merrifield Plantation stretched along the Mississippi River like a deliberate wound. Long and narrow, shaped by water and control. Sugar-cane fields ran in disciplined rows, their edges trimmed clean, their paths worn smooth by countless feet. The river was both boundary and artery, carrying steamboats heavy with cargo, traders with sharp eyes, and news that traveled faster than people ever could. The main house rose above the fields on brick pillars, its galleries wide enough to observe everything worth observing. From its upper floor, one could watch the quarters without being seen, could track movement by habit rather than effort. Behind it lay the sugar works, quiet most of the year, deadly when grinding season arrived. Farther back, half hidden by trees, sat the quarters. Rows of cabins pressed close together, their doors facing inward, lives compressed into spaces never meant for privacy. Surveillance here was not only enforced, it was expected. Bells dictated time. Whips corrected pace. Silence protected survival. People learned early that words could be dangerous and that some truths were better carried quietly, if at all. Births happened often. They were not moments of celebration. They were transactions. Children meant labor later, value later, profit deferred but anticipated. When Ruthie's labor began before sunrise that February morning, it did not disrupt the routine. She was young, strong, and had already given birth once before. Pain was familiar to her, not as something to fear, but as something to endure. The midwife, known to everyone as Old Hester, arrived without ceremony. She had delivered more children than anyone could count, had seen bodies fail and survive in every imaginable way. She moved through the cabin with efficiency born of repetition, her hands steady even as the small room filled with the smell of sweat, smoke, and damp wood. Ruthie clenched her jaw and stared at the wall, breathing through the pain, refusing to cry out. Sound invited attention. Attention invited trouble. The women around her spoke in low tones, not soothing so much as practical, guiding her breath, wiping her face, pressing cool cloth where heat rose. Outside, the plantation was waking. A bell rang once. Then again, feet moved on packed dirt. A wagon creaked in the distance. The world continued, indifferent. When the child finally emerged, there was a brief, sharp cry, high and insistent, life asserting itself as it always did. Hester cleaned the infant with practiced motions and lifted her toward the oil lamp to check breathing, limbs, and color. That was when her hands stopped. The skin beneath the flickering light was pale, not lightened by birth fluids, pale in a way that suggested absence rather than variation. The hair clung wetly to the scalp, so light it nearly reflected the flame. Hester leaned closer, her heart beating faster than she liked. In her mind, old stories rose uninvited. Tales passed between midwives late at night, the kind told in warnings and half-prayers. Children born with marks, children born wrong. But those stories never looked like this. When the baby's eyes opened, they caught the light and held it, blue, clear, unmistakable, a color that belonged to a different world. Hester felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She lowered the child quickly, as though speed might undo sight, wrapped her tighter than necessary, and handed her to Ruthie. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Ruthie looked down at the bundle in her arms. Her breathing slowed, then caught. She adjusted the cloth, searching for familiarity, for something that anchored the child to her world. She found none. The face staring back at her did not reflect her own. It did not reflect the man she had been paired with. It reflected nothing she understood. Ruthie's first thought was not rage. It was a blank, stunned question with no words. How? Her mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again. She did not scream. She did not accuse. She simply stared, her expression hollowing as understanding settled like a stone. In that moment, the cabin felt smaller, the air thicker, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Hester cleared her throat softly, forcing her hands to move again. "She's breathing fine," she said, too quickly. "She's strong." Ruthie did not respond. She ran a trembling finger over the baby's cheek, as if touch might change what sight had made certain. The baby blinked slowly, unbothered, and yawned. The ordinary motion was almost unbearable. It suggested normalcy where none existed. When the man recorded as the father was brought in later that morning, summoned from the fields, his reaction was immediate. He stopped in the doorway and did not step closer. His eyes moved from the baby to Ruthie and back again, and something hardened behind them. "That ain't mine," he said flatly. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. The cabin went silent except for the baby's small sounds. Ruthie tightened her grip. "She is," Ruthie whispered, but the words sounded like they belonged to someone else. He stared at the child as if she were an insult made flesh. He shook his head once, slow and final, as if correcting a mistake. "I know my blood," he said, and left the cabin. He didn't slam the door. He didn't curse. He simply walked out and did not look back. That was worse. It meant there would be no argument to resolve, no fight that could end with exhausted forgiveness. There would only be absence, and absence had its own sharp edges. By midday, the quarters buzzed with controlled curiosity. People found reasons to pass by, to glance inside, to confirm what they had heard. Some arrived with sympathy and left with fear. Some arrived with fear and left with suspicion. In places like this, unusual things did not bring comfort. They brought consequences. A child who looked wrong would not be treated like a child. She would be treated like a problem that had to be explained, pinned down, controlled. Women whispered about distant ancestry, about some long-buried blood resurfacing. Men whispered about shame, about betrayal. Older women whispered about punishment, not from God, but from the world itself. as if the plantation were a living thing that punished unpredictably. Ruthie heard all of it through a haze, her body aching, her mind fixed on one thought. She could not change what had happened, but she could decide what happened next. That decision began with silence. Ruthie did not speak of nights. She did not speak of fear. She did not speak of anything that might give shape to the impossible. She simply insisted, again and again, when asked, that she had been with no one else. It was not defiance. It was survival. She understood something, even in exhaustion. If she claimed the wrong thing, she would not be punished alone. Her baby would pay too. By evening, the overseer knew. Elias Crow arrived without announcement, his presence alone enough to quiet the room. Crow was not loud. He did not need to be. He had the kind of authority that came from control rather than temper. He stood in the doorway, eyes scanning quickly, taking in faces, movements, the way people positioned themselves away from him. He asked Ruthie a few questions, his tone measured. Where had she been assigned recently? Had she been in the main house? Had she been in the laundry? Had she been alone? Ruthie answered steadily. She had done her work. She had been where she was told to be. She had been with no one else. Her voice did not waver. Crow believed her, and that belief unsettled him, because if she was telling the truth, then the truth was not simple. Crow stepped closer to the child. Under better lamplight, the baby's pale skin looked almost luminous. The hair was so light it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the eyes, when they opened, fixed on Crow with that clear, icy blue that made his stomach tighten. He had seen mixed children. He had seen the variations of ancestry that people quietly accepted when it suited them. This was different. This looked like something forced. Crow straightened and said nothing. He did not demand punishment. He did not raise his voice. He simply stared a moment longer than necessary, then left. That night, alone in his office, Crow opened the ledger himself. He turned the pages slowly, aware that he was crossing a line he could not uncross. He drew a thin column along the margin, pressed his pen to the page, and wrote smaller than he ever had before. He did not speculate. He did not accuse. He recorded only what existed. He told himself it was nothing, an anomaly, nature's mistake, the explanation everyone wanted. But when he closed the book, the room felt different, as if the ledger had absorbed something that should not be contained. Crow's house sat between the main house and the quarters, positioned like a knot tying two worlds together. He poured himself a drink he did not need and didn't touch it. He listened to the plantation at night, the distant murmur of the river, the faint creak of boards, the occasional cough carried through damp air. He told himself the problem would settle, that in a week the baby would look less strange, that people would grow bored of staring. But the opposite happened. In the days that followed, the baby's difference became sharper. As swelling faded and features formed, the child's face did not drift toward Ruthie's. It drifted away. The nose stayed narrow. The lips stayed thin. The hair, drying and curling slightly at the ends, remained pale. The eyes remained that alarming blue. Each day the child became more defined, more undeniably wrong in the setting of the quarters. Ruthie named her Eliza. The name came quietly, like a small act of ownership in a world that stole everything. She whispered it into the baby's ear while feeding her. She repeated it when the baby cried. Eliza, Eliza. The sound steadied Ruthie, as if naming could anchor what had drifted loose. But naming did not stop people from staring. Children in the quarters approached with the blunt curiosity of the young, then recoiled when scolded by adults. Some adults crossed themselves. Some muttered prayers. Some looked at Ruthie with a kind of cold calculation, as if trying to decide whether she had done something wrong or whether wrong had been done to her. That distinction mattered. If Ruthie had chosen it, they could blame her. If it had been forced, then the fear shifted outward, toward a threat none of them could name. Ruthie felt the judgment even when no one spoke. She carried Eliza close, kept her in shade, wrapped her head in cloth when sun was strong. Eliza's skin burned easily. A few minutes of midday light turned her cheeks red. Ruthie learned quickly to avoid that. In the evenings, when air cooled, she sat at the cabin's threshold and watched the river from afar, rocking Eliza while the day's sounds faded. She wondered if the river had seen what she couldn't remember seeing, if the current carried answers that would never return. Crow, meanwhile, did what overseers did best. He watched. He listened. He recorded. In the official records, the birth was entered like any other, with a father's name assigned as the man Ruthie had been paired with. The system demanded that. Paper required order. But in Crow's private column, he wrote what paper was not supposed to hold. He wrote the date. He wrote the description. And then he began writing the small things that didn't fit. Who visited the main house that month? Which tasks had required women to stay late? Which doors were left unlocked for convenience? He did this not because he cared about Ruthie's pain, but because disruption threatened productivity, and productivity was his responsibility. Yet even as he framed it that way in his own mind, something else moved beneath it, unease. The kind of unease that grows when you realize the rules you enforce do not protect you from what can happen in the dark. Rumors reached the river landing within a week. At the landing, men from other plantations came to load barrels, deliver mail, exchange goods. They also exchanged stories, careful ones, coded ones. A trader mentioned in passing that Merrifield had a strange baby. Another man laughed and said he'd heard stranger things. Crow stood nearby, pretending not to listen. He heard the tone shift when someone described the baby's hair as nearly white. He heard someone else say blue eyes, and then there was a pause. A brief silence that meant the story had crossed from curiosity into something else. Crow watched the men's faces. Even those who dismissed the rumor did so too quickly, as though speed could keep fear from settling in. That same day, the plantation owner, Everett Mallory, asked Crow about the child. Mallory was not a monster by reputation, which in this world meant only that he preferred calm cruelty over loud cruelty. He valued appearances. He valued order. He valued not being embarrassed. He called Crow into the study, a room that smelled of tobacco and polished wood, and asked for facts, not feelings. Crow provided facts. The child's appearance, Ruthie's insistence, the father's denial. Mallory's face tightened. No more talk of it, Mallory said. It stays in the quarters. Crow nodded. Mallory leaned forward. The child is recorded properly. Yes, sir, Crow said. Then that's the end of it, Mallory replied, as though paper could end reality. Crow left the study with a familiar bitterness. Men like Mallory believed that if something was not spoken, it did not exist. They believed silence was control. But Crow had lived long enough on plantations to know silence could be the opposite. Silence could be what happened when people were too afraid to speak. As weeks turned into months, Eliza became a fixture of discomfort. She began to crawl, then to stand, gripping furniture with small hands. Her hair lightened further in the sun, not darkening the way many babies' hair did. The contrast between her and the other children sharpened until it seemed almost theatrical, like someone had placed her there deliberately to be seen. That perception mattered. Even if it wasn't true, it was what people felt, and feelings guided behavior as much as orders did. Crow noticed women avoiding certain routes near the main house, not openly, subtly, choosing longer paths, staying in groups, refusing to linger in hallways. Some took punishments that seemed irrational, accepting a slap or a harsh word rather than staying alone to finish a task. When Crow asked why, they offered nothing. Fear made people poor liars. It also made them wise. Ruthie said little. She moved through days like someone protecting something fragile. Yet there were nights when she woke suddenly, heart racing, certain she had heard footsteps, certain she had felt a presence. She could never prove it. By morning there was nothing. In places like Merrowfield, the absence of proof was not comfort. It was a warning. Crow's private column filled with small notes, unlocked doors, late arrivals, visitors whose names were spoken to casually, men who carried letters with seals, riders who came and went without explanation. Crow didn't yet know which detail mattered, only that something did. And then, on a damp night in late summer, as thunder rolled far upriver, Crow saw something he could not write down cleanly. A carriage arrived at the main house later than expected. Not unusual on its own, but it did not arrive with the chatter of guests or the bustle of servants preparing rooms. It arrived quietly. 2 men stepped out. One was Mallory himself, greeting them with stiff formality. The other man stayed partly in shadow, his hat brim low. Crow could not see his face clearly, only his posture, controlled and familiar, as if he belonged wherever he stood. Crow watched from a distance. He saw Mallory gesture toward the office, toward records, toward something administrative. The visitor nodded once. Then, without looking around, he walked past the office, not toward the study, but toward the path that led between the main house and the quarters. He did not go far. He stopped near the tree line and spoke quietly with Mallory. Then he turned back, returned to the carriage, and left. It could have been nothing. It could have been an inspection, an official, a clerk. But Crow noticed something that made his skin prickle as the carriage rolled away. One of the women assigned to late work in the kitchen stood frozen in the doorway, watching it with a look Crow had seen before in the cabin on the morning Eliza was born. Recognition, not of a face, of a threat. Crow's instincts told him to speak, to ask, to demand names. But instincts on plantations were dangerous. They got men dismissed. Worse, Crow did the only thing he could do without exposing himself. He opened the ledger again and wrote a final line beneath Eliza's entry, as small as he could manage. Presence noted. Late visit, unlogged. That was all. He closed the book, locked it, and sat in the quiet of his office, listening to the distant river and the nearer breathing of a plantation that pretended it slept. He understood then, with a cold certainty that settled behind his ribs, that Eliza was not just a strange child. She was a mark, evidence written onto a body, and if evidence existed once, it could exist again. He did not yet know where. He did not yet know when. He did not yet know who would be next. But he knew something else. something that made the hair rise on his arms as the candle burned low. Whatever had happened to Ruthie could happen without breaking any visible rule. It could happen through doors that were supposed to be guarded. It could happen under the cover of ordinary duties. It could happen in a world where silence was enforced and paperwork was treated like truth. Crow stared at the locked ledger and realized the most frightening part was not that the child looked wrong. The most frightening part was that the system around them was built in a way that made wrongness easy to hide. And as Eliza slept in Ruthie's arms, unaware of what her face meant to everyone who saw it, Crow felt certainty harden into dread, because deep down he already understood what the river would eventually confirm. This was not the last time. The second birth did not happen at Merrifield, and that single fact changed the shape of everything. If Eliza had been alone, she could have been buried under explanations, the way uncomfortable things always were. Ancestry, coincidence, God's will. The system was built to absorb irregularities without consequence. But when the rumor reached Marrowfield in the late spring of the following year, carried quietly by a boatman who lingered too long at the riverbank, Crow felt the shift before he understood it. The man spoke casually, as though he was sharing a curiosity rather than a warning. He said a child had been born a priver at a plantation called Larkspur Bend. He said the baby was a boy. He said the skin was pale, the hair light, the eyes blue. He laughed at the end, the way people laughed when they wanted to distance themselves from fear, and said strange things happened all the time. Crow nodded as if he agreed. He did not ask questions. Questions invited memory, and memory invited responsibility. That night, he opened the ledger and added a second entry in the narrow column he had hoped would remain empty. He wrote the date. He wrote the location. He wrote just enough to confirm that Eliza was no longer singular. Larkspur Bend lay less than 10 miles upriver, close enough that the river connected them like a shared vein. It was larger than Marrowfield, wealthier, more tightly run. Its owner believed discipline was the only thing separating profit from chaos. Crow rode there under ordinary pretense, exchanging records that could have waited, simply to see what could not be described properly in words. The quarters there were arranged differently, the cabins spaced farther apart, but the tension felt familiar. The mother was young, assigned to laundry and occasional housework. The midwife avoided Crow's eyes when he arrived. The baby was real, pale in the same way, light-haired, blue-eyed. The father of record stood rigid at the edge of the room, arms crossed, saying nothing. He did not need to. His silence was denial enough. Crow left without comment, but the image followed him back downriver, settling behind his eyes like something unfinished. Within weeks, whispers surfaced again, this time from downriver. A plantation near the marshlands. A girl, the same look. Crow did not ride out to see that one. He didn't need to. He already knew what he would find. Instead, he began listening differently. He listened to traders who stopped at multiple landings, to overseers who spoke too carefully, to midwives whose hands shook when they described what they had seen. The stories varied in detail, but not in substance. Different mothers, different fathers of record, different plantations, same impossible children. The river carried the information efficiently, stitching together places that pretended they were separate. At each location, the reaction followed the same arc. Shock, denial, suppression. Owners demanded silence. Overseers recorded what paper required and ignored the rest. Mothers learned quickly that speaking did not bring relief. Fathers learned just as quickly that distance was easier than doubt. Crow watched relationships fracture in ways that were never recorded. Men moved cabins, requested reassignment, stopped speaking to women they had lived beside for years. The women absorbed this quietly. Their grief turned inward, their focus narrowed to survival. Crow's private column grew longer. Dates accumulated. Locations spread along the river like a slow infection. He began marking them on a map, not as accusations, but as points of reference. The pattern unsettled him not because it existed, but because of what it suggested. These births were not clustered by bloodline or geography alone. They followed access. Each mother had been assigned, briefly, to work closer to the main house, cleaning, serving, late tasks performed, when oversight was lax and doors were unlocked for convenience. Crow noticed something else as well. Between the births were stretches of quiet, months where nothing happened, long enough for people to relax, long enough for fear to dull. Then another child would appear, and the whispers would surge again. It felt deliberate, though Crow could not yet explain why. By the third year, the women had begun to understand something the men refused to articulate. They did not speak of it openly. They did not need to. They warned each other through behavior, refusing certain assignments, moving in pairs, accepting punishment rather than isolation. Overseers noticed the resistance and responded with force, but force did not restore trust. It only deepened fear. Productivity dipped. Tension rose. Owners blamed management. Management blamed disobedience. No one blamed the thing that could not be named. Crow tried to speak once, carefully, to an overseer from another plantation, framing his concerns as logistical rather than moral. The man laughed it off too quickly and changed the subject. Crow learned then that fear did not always look like panic. Sometimes it looked like refusal. By the time the fifth child was born, Crow stopped hoping for coincidence. He no longer asked whether the pattern existed. He asked how it functioned. He reviewed records that had nothing to do with births. Visitor logs, inspection notices, letters sealed rather than signed. Men who appeared briefly at multiple plantations within short spans of time, men whose presence required no explanation. He noticed that some visits coincided too neatly with the quiet periods between births. Not visits meant to socialize, but visits meant to evaluate, to observe, to authorize. The realization disturbed him more than the children themselves, because it suggested the system was not being violated. It was being used. Crow felt the walls closing in, not around him, but around the truth. The more he learned, the clearer it became that whatever was happening did not rely on secrecy alone. It relied on structure, on routine, on people doing what they were told without asking why. The river kept moving. Boats kept coming. Children kept being born who should not exist. And with each new birth, the same questions spread quietly from plantation to plantation, never spoken aloud, but felt all the same. If this could happen here, where else had it already happened? They wanted a name, and by the third year that desire had hardened into something desperate and dangerous. Patterns frightened people more than crimes ever could, because a crime suggested a beginning and an end, while a pattern suggested intention without a face. A pattern implied design. It implied permission. Along the river, plantation owners had begun to feel something they were not accustomed to feeling. Loss of control. Productivity had slipped in ways that reports could not easily explain. Women refused certain assignments with a stubbornness that bordered on defiance. Men fought among themselves more often. Overseers wrote longer reports filled with defensive language, careful phrasing, and justifications no one had asked for. In New Orleans parlors, the rumors had begun to circulate with sharper edges, spoken softly enough to avoid confrontation, but loudly enough to stain reputations. Something was wrong along the river, and everyone knew it. What they could not tolerate was not knowing who to blame. The system did not require truth. It required resolution, and resolution required a culprit. The names surfaced gradually, as though the community itself were easing into it, testing it for fit before committing. Dr. Nathaniel Ward. Ward was not from the river parishes originally. He had arrived several years earlier from farther north, carrying letters of recommendation and a medical education that impressed the right people. He was unmarried, quiet, and precise. He traveled frequently, offering his services to plantations that could afford them, moving between main houses and quarters with a professionalism that discouraged questions. He stayed overnight when cases required it. He treated fevers, infections, broken bones, and complicated pregnancies. He was trusted, or at least tolerated, everywhere he went. Most importantly, he was an outsider. Crow heard Ward's name first as a suggestion, not an accusation, spoken by another overseer at the river landing while watching barrels being loaded. You ever notice how often that doctor's around when things get strange? The man asked, staring out at the water as if he were talking to the river itself. Crow did not answer immediately. Silence invited elaboration. I mean, he's everywhere, the overseer continued. Moves more than any of us. Has reasons to be alone with people. You know how it is. Crow nodded once. He did not confirm or deny. That nod was enough. Once Ward's name entered the conversation, memory began rearranging itself around it. People recalled his visits more clearly than they had at the time. Timelines sharpened. Coincidences aligned. Ward had been present at Merrowfield during the winter before Eliza's birth, called to treat a lingering fever in the main house. He had visited Larkspur Bend within months of the second birth, staying overnight when complications arose with the owner's wife. Records showed him attending a dinner downriver shortly before another child was born there. Each overlap, taken alone, was meaningless. Taken together, they formed a story people wanted to believe. Crow felt uneasy as the theory spread, not because it lacked logic, but because it offered comfort too quickly. It explained access. It explained opportunity. It gave fear a face that could be removed. Owners began to repeat the idea among themselves, at first cautiously, then with growing confidence. Overseers followed suit. The pressure to agree mounted subtly. To question the theory now felt like obstruction, like prolonging a problem everyone wanted gone. The women noticed the shift before anyone explained it. Assignments that had become battlegrounds resumed without resistance. Overseers softened enforcement slightly, as if the threat had been contained. The atmosphere changed, not to safety, but to something resembling it. Even Ruthie sensed the difference. The look she received altered in tone. Less suspicion, more pity. Eliza remained strange, still stared at, still whispered about. But the fear around her had been redirected outward, toward a man whose name could be spoken aloud. Crow, however, could not shake the feeling that something essential was being ignored. The neatness of the solution troubled him. Real patterns were rarely neat. They frayed at the edges. They resisted closure. But Crow understood the machinery of the place well enough to recognize when it had made a decision. He was summoned to Briar House, the old residence near the parish seat where men gathered when matters required discretion. The parlor was heavy with tobacco, smoke, and tension. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle, facing an empty space where Ward stood when Crow entered. Ward looked thinner than Crow remembered. His face was pale, his movements controlled but tight, as though he were holding himself together through will alone. He nodded briefly to Crow, not in greeting, but in acknowledgement, then looked away. The accusations came wrapped in civility at first. Questions about his movements, his reasons for travel, his access to women assigned to the main houses. Ward answered calmly, explaining schedules, duties, professional necessity. He did not deny presence. He did not deny opportunity. He denied intent. "I am a physician," he said quietly. "I go where I am called." One owner interrupted sharply, voice edged with accusation. "And you're alone with women, often." Ward stiffened, just slightly. "In the course of treatment," he replied. Crow watched the exchange with growing discomfort. No one asked about the births Ward could not account for. No one mentioned the long, quiet periods. No one questioned why the pattern appeared and disappeared. They were not investigating. They were confirming. As the discussion grew louder, the language shifted from concern to outrage. Words like violation and scandal were spoken, not because anyone intended to pursue justice, but because anger made the decision feel righteous. Ward listened without interruption, his jaw tightening, his hands clenched at his sides. When he was finally allowed to speak again, he said something that lodged deep in Crow's memory. "If I had done what you're suggesting," Ward said, voice steady despite the room's hostility, "this would look very different. Women would speak. Chaos would follow. Patterns would not be so controlled. I am not your answer." For a moment, the room went quiet. Then someone laughed, sharp and dismissive. "That's exactly what a guilty man would say." The decision followed swiftly. Ward would leave the parishes immediately. His practice would be dissolved. There would be no charges, no public disgrace. He would simply be gone. The matter would be considered resolved. Crow felt something heavy settle in his chest as Ward accepted the terms without protest. Relief flickered across the faces of the men present. This was what they wanted, an ending that required no deeper reckoning. Ward departed within days. Crow watched him board a riverboat at dawn, a single trunk at his feet. Ward did not look angry. He did not look afraid. He looked relieved. That detail disturbed Crow more than any denial could have. The effect of Ward's removal was immediate. Weeks passed, then months, without incident. No new births, no whispers, no rumors carried on the river. Women accepted assignments again. Overseers relaxed their watch. Productivity rebounded. Owners congratulated themselves quietly on having acted decisively. Crow alone remained unsettled. He continued to write. He continued to mark dates. He continued to track movements. The silence felt wrong. It did not feel like resolution. It felt like pause. Nearly a year passed before the next child was born. When Crow heard of it, the news came not with whispers, but with fear. The midwife who spoke to him looked unwell, her hands trembling as she described what she had seen. The plantation was one Ward had never visited. The timing did not fit. The child was the same. Pale skin, light hair, blue eyes. Crow sat alone with the ledger open before him and felt the illusion collapse completely. He wrote out himself to confirm what he already knew, his heart pounding harder with every mile. The sight of the child erased any remaining doubt. Ward had not been the cause. He had been the answer people wanted, not the one they needed. As Crow returned home, the truth sharpened into something unbearable. The births had not stopped because the problem had been solved. They had stopped because something else had paused. Something that did not depend on Ward at all. That night, Crow reopened his map and spread it across the desk. He circled the long, quiet period. Then he marked a new birth. And then he saw it. The gap aligned not with Ward's absence, but with a change in something else entirely. Administrative schedules, inspections delayed, official visits rerouted, movements that required no explanation because they were part of the system itself. Crow leaned back in his chair, hands trembling, and understood the final, terrible truth of what they had done. They had not removed the threat. They had simply removed the distraction. They had removed the wrong man. And whatever had been mistaken for relief was nothing more than the system adjusting itself, quietly and efficiently, before continuing its work. Crow stopped looking for men and started looking for language. That was the moment the story turned from something disturbing into something unbearable. Individuals could lie. Individuals could be removed. Individuals could be blamed and forgotten. But language revealed intent in ways faces never could. He returned to the records he had handled for years without truly reading them. The ones that passed through his hands as part of ordinary duty. Inspection reports, inventory adjustments, compliance notices. He spread them across his desk late at night, lamp turned low, windows shut tight against the sound of the river. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The words were familiar, repetitive, dry. But as he read them with different eyes, patterns began to surface that had nothing to do with births and everything to do with control. Certain phrases appeared again and again, tucked into margins and appendices where no one lingered. Authorized reassignment, temporary relocation, special access approved. Each phrase meant something small on its own, a minor bureaucratic adjustment that required no explanation. Together, they formed a map of movement that bypassed the ordinary chain of command. Crow realized with a sickening clarity that he had been looking in the wrong direction. The question was not who had violated the rules. The question was which rules made violation unnecessary. He pulled older files from storage, some dating back years before Eliza's birth. The handwriting changed. The ink faded. The terminology did not. In reports marked confidential, enslaved people were not described as men or women. They were assets, units, labor inputs. In certain documents, a different word appeared. One Crow had never noticed before because it had been buried among numbers. Specimens. The term appeared sparingly, always in sections discussing productivity, optimization, and asset evaluation. Crow felt his stomach tighten. Specimens were not people. They were materials. Objects to be tested, measured, adjusted. He traced the reports backward, following the chain of authorization. Each adjustment had been approved by an inspector, someone whose visits were routine and unquestioned. Inspectors moved constantly along the river, auditing plantations, reviewing compliance, ensuring that operations aligned with broader administrative goals. They outranked overseers. They answered to officers rather than individuals. Their presence required no announcement because it was expected. Crow had seen them countless times. Men in plain coats carrying seals instead of weapons, speaking softly, observing everything. He had never thought to fear them. The realization hit him slowly, then all at once. The births followed inspections. Not every inspection, only certain ones. Rotational audits conducted under a specific mandate, scheduled irregularly enough to avoid notice, but predictably enough to form clusters. During those periods, certain women were reassigned closer to the main house. Late work, isolated tasks, roles justified by efficiency. Crow found the memorandum that confirmed it buried deep in a folder marked Operational Review. The language was clinical, stripped of emotion, concerned only with outcomes. It proposed limited trials to improve asset versatility, arguing that certain physical traits increased market flexibility and domestic utility. The document never described how those traits would be introduced. It did not need to. It assumed access. It assumed authority. It assumed silence. Crow read the memorandum 3 times, each reading colder than the last. This was not perversion disguised as science. This was administration disguised as progress. The horror was not hidden. It was normalized. Crow followed the approvals listed at the bottom of the page, initials rather than names, offices rather than signatures. The trail led not upward to some shadowy mastermind, but sideways into the machinery of governance itself. The executor emerged not as an architect, but as a facilitator. Inspector Samuel Griggs. Griggs was not powerful in the way owners were powerful. He owned nothing. He commanded no land. His power came from movement and legitimacy. He enforced policy. He implemented programs approved elsewhere. He ensured compliance. Crow remembered him clearly now. A man of average height, unremarkable face, calm voice. A man who never raised suspicion because he never raised his voice. Griggs had been present at Merrifield shortly before Eliza's birth. Crow remembered signing off on an audit that required no follow-up. He remembered Griggs walking the perimeter, noting adjustments, requesting small changes that seemed reasonable at the time. Crow felt the weight of complicity settle on him like a physical thing. He had facilitated access without knowing what it meant, or perhaps without wanting to know. Crow requested a meeting with Griggs under the pretense of clarifying discrepancies. Griggs received him in a modest office attached to the courthouse, a space so unremarkable it seemed designed to be forgotten. The shelves held binders, not books. The desk was clean. The air smelled faintly of ink and dust. Griggs gestured for Crow to sit, his expression neutral. Crow did not accuse. Accusation would end the conversation. Instead, he described what he had seen. The births, the timing, the clusters, the language in the reports. He spoke carefully, as though discussing logistics rather than lives. Griggs listened without interruption. When Crow finished, Griggs nodded once. "You're observant," he said. The admission struck harder than denial ever could. "This was approved," Crow said quietly. Griggs did not argue. "It was authorized," he replied. Crow felt something break inside him. "You're talking about people," he said. Griggs tilted his head slightly. "I'm talking about assets," he corrected gently. "The law makes that distinction very clear." Crow stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "It's wrong," he said. Griggs did not disagree. "That word doesn't appear in any directive I enforce," he said calmly. Crow understood then that outrage had no leverage here. Morality was irrelevant. Legality was everything, and legality had already been decided elsewhere. "Why stop?" Crow asked, his voice strained. "Why end it now?" Griggs's expression shifted just slightly. "Because resistance increased," he said. "Productivity declined. The cost-benefit ratio changed." Crow felt sick. "So it ends quietly," he said. Griggs nodded. "No announcement. No acknowledgement. The program has concluded." Crow left the office in silence, his mind racing. That night, he copied everything. Not summaries. Not impressions. Exact language, dates, approvals. He hid the copies in separate places, understanding that memory was the enemy of systems like this. Systems survived by erasure. The births slowed, then stopped. Not because justice had been served, but because the experiment had ended. Women were reassigned. Inspectors rotated elsewhere. The machinery moved on. Officially, nothing had happened. Eliza grew older. She learned to read discarded papers. She asked questions Ruthie could not answer. Crow watched her and understood the final horror of it all. The children had never been accidents. They had been data points, prototypes, evidence of a process that worked well enough to be shut down without scandal. Crow closed the ledger one last time, knowing the program had ended not with punishment or reform, but with quiet satisfaction. The system had tested itself, recorded the results, and moved on, leaving behind lives that would never fit cleanly into any column. The program ended the way it had always been designed to end. Quietly. There were no announcements posted on courthouse doors, no letters sent to plantations explaining a change in policy, no acknowledgement that anything extraordinary had ever taken place. Inspectors simply stopped requesting certain reassignments. Audit schedules shifted. The language that had once appeared in appendices vanished as if it had never existed. For men who lived by paperwork, this was enough. A thing that was no longer written was a thing that no longer existed. No one apologized because apologies required victims, and victims required recognition. The system did not recognize people. It recognized assets, and assets were adjusted, depreciated, or written off without ceremony. The children who remained were never grouped together. That, too, was deliberate. Keeping them apart prevented comparison, prevented conversation, prevented pattern recognition. Some were sold downriver under different descriptions, marketed carefully according to their appearance. Light-skinned children fetched different prices. They were described as suitable for domestic service, as refined, as adaptable. Language softened their reality while sharpening their value. Other children were kept close to main houses, dressed better, fed differently, trained for visibility rather than labor. Their presence became a quiet proof of concept no one named aloud. The mothers bore the longest consequences. Ruthie lived long enough to understand that silence did not protect her from memory. She watched Eliza grow into a girl whose face drew attention everywhere she went. Attention that was not admiration. Attention that carried expectation, suspicion, entitlement. Ruthie learned to read rooms before entering them, to gauge which version of her daughter the world expected to see. She learned when to encourage quiet, when to insist on confidence, when to disappear altogether. Other mothers fared worse. Some lost their children to sail before they could form attachments strong enough to survive separation. Some learned to harden themselves, withholding affection not out of cruelty, but out of a desperate attempt to survive inevitable loss. Love, in that world, was a liability. The end of slavery did not bring resolution. Freedom changed the terms, not the damage. The children who emerged into that new world carried bodies shaped by a past that refused to explain itself. Some tried to pass, leaving the river parishes entirely, changing names, altering stories, crossing lines that were not marked on maps. Passing offered safety at the cost of erasure. Others stayed and endured the ambiguity, never fully accepted by any community. Their existence complicated narratives people wanted to tell about identity, lineage, and belonging. Silence followed them like a shadow. Generations passed. The stories thinned, then thickened again in unexpected ways. A great-grandchild born with hair to light, eyes too blue. Questions asked quietly at family tables, then set aside when answers did not come. In archives, the fragments waited. Ledgers, memoranda categorized under neutral headings. Historians noticed inconsistencies and chose safer projects. To publish the truth would not indict a single villain. It would indict a structure. Most were not willing to do that. The system had succeeded not because it was secret, but because it was ordinary. It operated through paperwork, approval, and indifference. It required no monsters, only participation. That is what remained after the records faded. Not ghosts, not curses, but the understanding that the most terrifying acts do not announce themselves as evil. They arrive as procedure. They leave as silence. And sometimes, decades later, they surface again in the face of a child who cannot explain why they look the way they do. The system did not fail. It succeeded. And that is the part that refuses to stay buried.